All right, what's good, everybody? Now, before I get started, take a minute, thumb up the video, press the subscribe button. It's not going to cost you anything to subscribe. My information is free of charge. Now, I want to give a special shout out to a good friend of mine who wants to remain anonymous. So I will respect that. But from time to time, he will send me some information that he believes will assist me in getting the information and getting this history about hip hop's origins out to the public domain. So I definitely want to thank that brother. I want to be clear. I am in no way trying to minimize the enormous contributions by Herc or any of the other pioneers, okay? But there's much more to tell about this history than we are led to believe. Unfortunately, a lot of these individuals have been overlooked for decades. One such person is John Brown. Now, I've already did a video on John Brown recently. My good friend sent me a video of Pete Nice, who was a member of the rap group Third Base. He is now a curator at the Hip Hop Museum that will be opening this fall, I believe, in the Bronx. So let's listen to him as he talks about the museum and how John Brown fits in the hip hop origin story.
I'm Pete Nice. My background started my life in hip hop as an MC back in the 80s. I was in a group in the late 80s and 90s called Third Base on Def Jam Recordings. I grew up in Brooklyn, Queens, Long Island, ended up going to college at Columbia and graduated in Columbia 1989. And when I graduated, I told my mother that I was not getting a job, that I was going to release a record and sign a record contract. So she was not too thrilled about that. But when she saw me on Arsenio Hall a couple of months later, she was basically bragging to all her friends. So I made it out. But I also made it to this situation in my life many years after, the crux of my career as an MC, to be involved with the new hip hop museum, which has been being built in the Bronx pretty much for the last decade. Our executive director, Rocky Bucano, and a whole team of people have been working on this concept for over a decade, and it has now come to fruition. The building is constructed in Bronx next to the 149th Street Bridge and is planned to open in the fall of 2025. And we have the awesome responsibility of documenting, preserving, and capturing, basically telling the story of all the pioneers who created hip hop, put the foundation on their shoulders. And as we look at this first slide, this is a photograph, original Polaroid of Kool Herc, who many of us know is considered, the forefather or godfather of hip hop. This is him at the Hevelo Club on Jerome Avenue, right around 1975. The early days of hip hop, there's lots of folklore. And, when you look at the entire history of New York City going back hundreds of years, we're dealing with a culture that, really took hold from the early 1970s through the current day. So in the bigger picture, it's, a very new movement, and we're able to actually have people like Kool Herc still with us, and we're able to interview them. We're able to go through their archives and acquire items for the museum that tell their story. This photograph was Herc's, which he saved, and some other members of his family. His brother Kenny, also a bit of a family archivist himself, had his own collection. So, thanks to them, some of these, great relics to tell their stories are here. And, the Hip Hop Museum, we're able to go out into the actual communities, in this particular case, West Bronx, and try to find out what the story is. Other practitioners of hip hop, one in particular, Phase Two, who was one of the greatest aerosol writers in history, and b-boy, basically all the elements of hip hop he covered. Rest in peace, my boy Phase. But he was really also one of the first true historians of hip hop, and he would always tell stories about a DJ named DJ John Brown, who was Kool Herc's classmate in high school at Alfred E. Smith. And I'll just go to the next slide right here. So the story is, and like I said, hip hop is filled with folklore. One of our missions as a museum is to cut through a lot of the myths and get into more of the factual analysis of the history of hip hop. And everyone looks at August 11th, 1973 as the birthday of hip hop. And myself as a curator, and a curator along with Paradise Gray, who is the chief curator, we know that that's not the case, that a movement and a culture like hip hop was not formed in one day. It basically evolved. And when you look at the actual date that was picked out, the actual evidence, even directly for, is in contrast to that. Because here we have parties that Kool Herc was involved in 1972. So is hip hop 50? Is it 51? Is it 52? The first card is from 1972. You see his actual tag because he was a writer. He did involved in the early graffiti movement. The second one is from 1520 Sedgwick, later in the fall of 1973. So these are, actual documents which we're able to go into the community, to the practitioners, and, protect them and, hold them out there for our community in the Bronx, but also to the worldwide community, because, hip hop has really, stretched out internationally, to levels, and even in the recording industry and the rap music industry, to even take it further than even being the subculture that it started out as. Next slide. So back to phase two, and in getting these oral histories, we hear stories about people that we never knew about before. And one of those people was DJ John Brown. Phase two told me that DJ John Brown was an early DJ at a club called the Plaza Tunnel, which was in the basement of the Grand Concourse Hotel on the Grand Concourse across from Yankee Stadium. And he said that was the place where John Brown would play particular records, focus on records that had breaks, funky records that Faze and other guys like Bosco and Wallace D, Disco King Mario, and some of the Black Spades would actually up rock and do some of the, quote unquote new dance moves that were the seedlings of breaking. And John Brown was that guy who provided, that platform. He was also classmate of Kool Herc's. Herc went to these parties. Another DJ from that point, DJ Smokey, went to these parties. So we have the opportunity with the Hip Hop Museum to actually try to track down people like DJ John Brown. No one knew where he was. I got one of these people finder applications, and a guy named Midas, who just released his book, The Birth of Breaking, had found John Brown's picture in his high school yearbook, and it was John D. Brown III. With that information, we were able to actually track him down. He lived in the same neighborhood in High Bridge, right in that backyard, right in his own backyard that he'd been in all these years. He's in his 70s. And we were able to interview John. This Polaroid is John Brown at the Plaza Tunnel in 1971. So he spun at the Plaza Tunnel from 1971 till it closed in 1973. And, this is the greatest evidence of, the myths that we heard and the stories from phase two. Next slide, please. Now, because we're able to reach out, there's so many friends and legends that we lost, like Biz Markie, DMX, Scott LaRock, Jam Master Jay, that many and the majority of the practitioners of hip hop are still alive and with us, and we're able to speak to them and do these oral histories. In this case, John Brown wrote down some of his own story and gave some kind of mind-blowing background as to, how much there is that we don't know about the origins of hip hop. The first photo was Kool Herc at the Hevelo, and it turns out that after John Brown left the Plaza Tunnel, the bartender at the Plaza Tunnel opened up the club called the Hevelo. And John Brown was the first DJ at the Hevelo before Kool Herc. So, John Brown talks about how he started and, really what his place in hip hop is. He refers to himself as the missing link that no one really knows about. And luckily, we're able, through the Hip Hop Museum and this new entity, we're able to tell his story and the early story of hip hop. Next slide. Now, this is the actual evidence. Like, hip hop is based so much on music. Sorry, I have a little noise problem here. Music is the basis of, hip hop, and the DJ is the center of that, and, the most critical element that gave rise to all the rest. And however, the early documentation and sound of those parties is almost impossible to find. And through Kool Herc's brother, who preserved this tape for many, many decades, this is a actual cassette tape, a Maxell tape that was manufactured in 1977, of 45 minutes of a Kool Herc jam at the Executive Playhouse in 1977. And you can hear Kool Herc on the mic shouting out certain people in the early talking method that some of the earliest MCs would entertain the crowd with. And you hear all the foundational breaks, the James Browns, the Baby Hueys, the Jimmy Casters. And I mean, it really takes you back, captures that moment. And, the only reason we were able to have this evidence is reaching out to the people in the community. So we're hoping that, as the museum opens in 2025, that, we'll be able to further connect to so many different people that have their own stories and kind of, show the rich culture of hip hop, where it came from and where it's going in the future.
Now, it's clear from what Pete Nice said, hip hop didn't start in 1973 at 1520 Sedgwick Avenue or 1975 at the Hevelo. As I've said for years, hip hop is an evolution of music and dance that can clearly be traced to Black American culture. Let me say that again. It can be traced to Black American culture. Although Pete Nice didn't say it came from Black American culture, he recognized that the culture was heavily influenced by Black Americans, citing the type of music being played and the MC style reflected in those times. As Pete Nice said on the outset of his video, hip-hop history has a lot of folklore. We need more people like Pete Nice, who is not afraid to tell the truth and shame the devil. Now, if you really think about it, the more we dig into this history, more and more people are talking about hip-hop starting in 71. Herc said it started in 71. Charlie Chase said 71. Fat Mike said it was 71. Phase 2 said it was 71. Now, Pete Nice is suggesting 71. The more we dig, 71 might actually be the beginning. So if you haven't already, thumb up the video, definitely subscribe, share this information. Until the next time, peace.
Hey, white people, screw Black History Month. Tell them, Loki.
There's 5 Black Americans buried in Arlington National Cemetery that the White House no longer cares for you to know about.
Arlington National Cemetery is 639 acres, and over 400,000 people are buried here. That's soldiers, that's family dependents, and even foreign nationals. This is one of the most badass Black American soldiers that you've never heard of. He's one of the first Black pilots in the United States military. He was one of the last living Tuskegee Airmen. He had 409 combat missions in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Who am I talking about? The badass General Charles McGee.
General Charles Young was a West Point graduate and the first honorary member of Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated. Now, I said general, but if you look at his tombstone, it actually says colonel. And here's why. See, World War I broke out, and white officers did not want to have a black commanding officer. So they said that he was unfit for service. Well, Charles Young showed it. He rode his horse 497 miles from Wilberforce, Ohio to Washington, D.C. And still, they said he wasn't fit. However, in 2022, they finally made him a general.
The man, the myth, the legend, General Colin Powell was a soldier in the United States military for 35 years. He did 2 tours in Vietnam. He was awarded the Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. He also became the youngest and the first Black American Joint Chiefs of Staff and the first Black American Secretary of State. They don't make him like Colin Powell anymore.
Matthew Henson did 7 polar expeditions in 23 years, but was the first person to ever actually reach the North Pole. He died in 1955 and was buried in New York, but in 1988, President Ronald Reagan made an exception to the National Cemetery's burial policies and had him and his wife reinterred right here.
He was a surgeon, a Civil War veteran. He's the first Black American hospital administrator in U.S. history, and he's the first Black American faculty member at the Howard University. Dr. Alexander Thomas Augusta went to medical school in Canada because no white medical school would accept him here. And upon completion and graduation with honors, he applied to the Army to be a surgeon. They turned him down due to the color of his skin. So he wrote Abraham Lincoln a letter. He went to D.C. to plead his case, and the U.S. Army's board agreed to test him. And he tested off the charts, and they hired him, entering at the rank of major. Now, most of you don't realize we walked 7.5 miles making this video today. Now, I know I needed 7.5 miles, but I want you to remember one thing. Black history is American history and not just an epic February.
You just gonna leave me here?